Kant is extremely influential. He's widely considered to be one of the most important philosophers ever, right? And historically speaking, it's true. Historically speaking, it's true. Kant's influence has been enormous. However, Kant is also extremely controversial. And much of post-Kantian philosophy is actually philosophers reacting against Kant, right? So much of post-Kantian philosophy is reactions against Kant. So in people like, immediately starting with the German classical idealists, people like Fichte, especially Hegel. Hegel finds a lot to criticize in Kant. So likewise, Nietzsche's project in many ways can be seen as a repudiation of Kant's ideas. And also down the line, Karl Marx. So especially, I suppose, one idea that immediately comes to mind is the role of history. The role of history. Kant is very, what's the right phrase? So he's a very ahistorical thinker. He's not very well attuned to historical kind of reasoning, and that's going to be important. Anyway, so let me try to be brief, and let me try to be to the point. So Kant has two basic aspects that are important for us. So one is epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge, right? And the second one is his ethics, obviously. And when he talks about his ethics, right, there's some consequence for politics, so maybe we will say at least a word about that. Let's start with Kantian epistemology. And again, Kant can get very technical very quickly, very difficult, therefore. So I want to try to keep this simple. Let's start somewhere, on the surface. So we've already talked a little bit about René Descartes and David Hume, right? This notion, again, with Descartes, this phrase, the epistemological turn, that before the Cartesian revolution, before the Cartesian rediscovery of the European subject, right, there was this idea that philosophy talks about objects in the real world, objects in the real world. So Aristotle begins his philosophy by asking, what is there, what exists, right? And starting with Descartes, we say, no, before you can ask what is there, you have to ask a question of how do you know, right? So this is the famous epistemological turn. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about Descartes. And again, the idea is that you do not concentrate on the questions of ontology, of what is there, right? But you rather concentrate on the question of knowledge. How do you know? And when you focus on the question of knowledge, you get to the idea of, very importantly, to the idea of the subject and the mind and the ideas in the mind. So so here, Aristotle talks about objects in the world. Aristotle talks about objects in the world, whereas Descartes is going to talk about ideas in the head. So ideas in the mind of the subject, right? And in an important sense, for this reason, Aristotle's philosophy was objective. It was about the objective world, whereas Cartesian philosophy in very many ways is subjective. It is about your subjective mental life, right? And this is the idea that we're going to explain now and say some more. So obviously, this is going to be important in terms of empiricism, of people like David Hume, and so we already talked about Hume, so we have some knowledge of what this is about. Again, that all knowledge comes from experience, and experience is not out there. Experience is in here. It's in the mind. Experience is always subjective in the sense that, again, when I look at this marker, the standard account, especially in 2020 or in 2021 now, right, is that I don't actually, in many ways, when I talk about the marker, or at least that's one way of putting it. This is controversial, of course, but everything in philosophy is controversial. But like strictly speaking, if you think about this, when I talk about the marker, I don't actually talk about the marker out there in the world. No. When I talk about it, I have a certain subjective experience, so the marker means something to me. I have an experience of redness, or an experience of firmness, or a certain smell, right? Characteristic smell of the whiteboard markers, right? So to me, the marker is a bundle of impressions, and these impressions are subjective, and they are in my head. And so in many ways, philosophy after Descartes, to a very large extent, stops talking about objects in the world and begins talking about ideas in the head. I hope this point is not too difficult. Again, we talked about this a lot before. You could immediately ask, and Kant exactly does this, and before Kant, people like Locke asked this question, what is there on the other side of our experience? What is there on the other side of our experience? And you see, it would be nice. I'm not sure if I could draw this. I'm not sure even how to draw this, right? But if you imagine, you'll have to excuse my artistic skills, but if you imagine this is my head, right? Right? And here's the object. I don't know, an apple. I'm going to try to draw an apple. Probably going to fail, but whatever. You'll have to imagine it's an apple, right? So the idea is that it would be nice if I could jump outside of my own head and occupy this somehow third position, God's eye view, the view from nowhere. Let me write God. And compare what I see inside my head to the way the apple really looks. It would be very nice if you could jump outside of our cognition, outside of our experience, or also maybe outside of our language, because philosophers after Kant, prompted by Kant, will also thematize the importance of language for all of this, right? So jump outside of our conceptual and perceptual categories and compare what the experience looks like to me inside my head to the apple as it exists, right? And it would be nice, but of course it is impossible, because any kind of operation that takes me from within my head into some kind of third position, it's not really me stepping outside of my head, it's just me moving my head. So if I look through a telescope, I don't see the objective reality as it really is. It's just my subjective experience changes, right? So when I look through a telescope, or when I look through a microscope, or some kind of electron microscope, or I don't know, mass spectrometer, or whatever, any kind of scientific tool in this sense does not give me access to objects as they are. It just gives me access to more and different experiences. More and different experiences. What you see in the microscope is not the world as it really is. You see blotches of light. You see shapes, right? And your mind, so to speak, works on those shapes to make sense of them. It's a different kind of experience, and you can try to compare one type of experience against another type of experience. That's a possible thing to do, obviously, right? So you compare one experience to another experience, but you never get to the thing as it exists in itself, right? And this is, in many ways, so when we talk about Kantian epistemology, this is the most important idea in Kantian epistemology, by far, right? That in the world, so to speak, we are entitled to talk about two things. One is what Kant calls the phenomena, from the Greek word phainein, which means to show itself, to show forth. So phenomena are appearances. So things as they appear to us. And notice, so the singular is phenomenon, the plural is phenomena. It's very clear, it's very obvious that there are many phenomena, different phenomena of experience. So I feel a certain temperature in the room. That's one kind of experience. Again, I have a certain feeling of solidity of this table. That's another kind of experience, right? I feel the weight of the clothing on my body. That's a third kind of experience. And you continue, go on and on and on. There are many phenomena. And the question is, what is it? What is it that lies on the other side of the phenomena? Now, again, if you look at this picture, if you think about this carefully, if you take this picture to heart, it should be obvious to you that there's no way that you can jump outside of the human condition and view this from the side. So the noumena, this is the next term I'm going to write on the board. The things as they are in themselves are never really accessible to me. So again, I can take this marker and I can look at it from different sides. Again, I can smell it. I can maybe even put it through a mass spectrometer, but I can never get to the marker as it exists in itself. Right? At the end of the day, even the reconstruction of the marker in terms of atoms and molecules, or maybe protons and electrons, or maybe quarks and electrons, right? Or even the 17 quantum fields, that is still phenomenal, right? Our access to the quantum fields the quantum fields, at the end of the day, we believe that they exist because there are certain kinds of experiences that we can have in certain controlled environments, right? So you go to a Large Hadron Collider and you see certain things happening, but you see them with your eyes. You never see the things as they are in themselves. And by the way, one immediate proof, not proof, but one immediate corroborating evidence for this view is that physics is never really entitled to give us the final story of the universe, right? So for a very long time, before the atomic theory was invented, people had all sorts of ideas about what the world was made of, right? But once the atomic theory was invented, we had a certain notion of the atom, right? Different atoms like hydrogen, oxygen, right? Which are supposed to be substantial and indivisible, right? But later on, people discover radioactivity, and they realize that no, atoms can actually be broken down, and so atoms are not fundamental. So things which seemed solid and fundamental, we realized that we did not perceive things as they were. Our resolution was just not high enough to see below the atoms to the quarks and the electrons, right? And now you can ask the same thing. Is there something which is beyond quarks and beyond electrons, maybe preons, right? That's a hypothetical particle, right? So, and maybe it's there. There's again, so long as we're stuck within our head, we can never be certain if we have reached the rock bottom of reality, or maybe we have just, the resolution of our senses, right? Our sense apparatus has bottomed out and has reached, our senses have reached maximum resolution. Have we bottomed out in reality? Have we found reality as it really is? Or is it that we are simply in some things are just too small for us to see? Our resolution is not high enough, right? Anyway, so we have phenomena on this side, and on this side we have, the Greek word is noumena or noumenon. Let me write noumenon. Let me write it like this: noumenon or noumena, right? So this is appearances, things as they appear to us. This is things as they are in themselves. So things in themselves. I think in German it's Ding an sich, but my German is a bit rusty. This word comes from the Greek word nous, which means mind. So this is what shows itself to me. And this is something that I do not see, but which my mind postulates must exist. So again, go back a step, right? So I look at this marker, and to me it appears as a certain bundle of impressions inside of my own head. It's a bundle of impressions inside of my own head. But you could ask the question, what is on the other side of the impressions? What is on the other side of the impressions? And we have studied an array of philosophers, right, who would give us very different answers. So Malebranche and Goylings, who are in Russell's chapter, they will say that actually, marker, the way I see it, the idea of the marker in my head is res cogitans. It's an idea. And the material object is just synchronized by God, by pre-established harmony. It's synchronized by God. So it's like God gives me certain illusions inside of my own head which match onto reality, but the only reason why the illusions in my head match onto reality is because God is good and God is not a deceiver. So it's like on Malebranche and Goylings' view, or at least I'm not sure, but I think, right, you never really see the real world. God projects certain ideas into your head, right, which correspond to the real world and allow you to be effective in the world, although, at the end of the day, like, again, you're an immortal soul trapped in a mortal body. And again, like when I decide to raise my arm goes up for purely mechanistic reasons, for Malebranche and Goylings. And the only reason I feel causality is because, again, God synchronized the two worlds, the mental world and the material world, from time immemorial, right? Sorry, it's far too technical. But let's take another example. So somebody like Leibniz would say, well, actually, what the marker really is are the monads, right? The monads also have been synchronized. There's also pre-established harmony. But again, the deep truth of the marker on the other side is that it is a collection of this myriad monads, actually infinity, right? But there are different kinds of infinity. Some of them are larger than other kinds of infinity, right? Certain kind of infinite but limited in space constellation of these monads. This is what Leibniz would say. Spinoza would say that all of this is an illusion, of course. There is no such thing as multiplicity. And in fact, I think that the marker is different from me, but in fact, that's not true. Because me and marker, right, myself and the marker, we are both different aspects of the same single substance, which is God or nature, right? So in this sense, the appearance of separation and multiplicity would be an illusion. And this is why I write noumenon or noumena, so singular or plural. Because if you take somebody like Spinoza's view, there's actually only one noumenon in the world. There's only one noumenon, and this one noumenon is God or nature. If you take other philosophers, I don't know, pluralist philosophers, let's call them, I don't know, ancient Greek atomists. Ancient Greek atomists would say, no, there are many noumena. There are many noumena, many different things that make up my experience. Now, you could also ask this question, could it be that there's only phenomena without the noumena? It's kind of a tricky question. But I want to say that in a certain sense, probably not. I shouldn't talk about this because this is mostly my ideas and not ideas of Kant. But I would say, like, see, when I close my eyes and I want to see something, right? I can imagine a flower. Right? I can visualize a flower. I can do that. But when I open my eyes, I cannot really visualize a flower. You know, I see this marker as blue, and no matter how hard I try, I cannot I cannot force myself to see it red or green or yellow. The appearances force themselves upon me. So you could say that this forceful structure that forces certain experiences into my head, this is what we call noumena, whatever it is. And again, Kant will very importantly say that we can have no idea. And we cannot really even talk about this, because the only thing that philosophy can reasonably talk about are the things as they appear to us. Things as they are in themselves are perpetually, like, always and forever shut out, right? We have no access to them whatsoever and cannot ever have any access. Now, that's all fun and good. And in many ways, what I have said right now is not really very different from Descartes or Hume. So I think this is the easier and the more superficial part of Kant's philosophy. And also mostly less controversial. More people will agree with this. Again, philosophers have a tendency to disagree with everything. Of course, you can call this picture into question, but by and large, that's close to being the general consensus in the world today, in the world among philosophers. And here Kant goes further, right? So in addition to this, Kant wants to weaponize this picture, right? And very importantly, probably you have heard this famous notion that what Kant's project is, what Kant is trying to do, is he's trying to limit reason to make room for faith. Limit reason to make room for faith. To make room for faith. Right? Limit reason to make room for faith. And in this sense, in this way, Kant famously wrote at one point that he thought that the key task of philosophy is to some extent to reconcile, if you want, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, Newton with the Bible. Right? Newton gives us a picture of the deterministic world around us. One thing follows another thing with some kind of natural necessity. But if that is true, if the world is deterministic in this fashion, then it is not clear how the immortal soul can exist in this world, and also how morality can exist in this world, right? And now, of course, you could jump back and say, well, but does Newton really know the deep reasons behind his laws? And Newton, in response to Locke, as we have mentioned a couple classes ago, Newton, of course, realized that what he observed are just regularities in experience. So the scientific knowledge, the only thing that scientific knowledge can do is track regularities in experience. Keep track of, right? So track regularities in experience. And Newton has this very famous phrase. He says, I do not feign hypotheses. I do not propose or invent hypotheses. When he says this, basically what he means is that it appears to me, like when I look through my telescope, it appears to me that the planets actually follow my laws of motion, right? The laws of motion which I have invented. But why do they follow the laws of motion? This law of motion and not some other law of motion, I have no idea, right? It's a very deep notion, again, that all of our science, it seems, at bottom, rests just on regularities. And we do not have the understanding as to why those regularities obtain, right? So if you take my course in philosophy of science next year, we'll talk about this much more. This wonderful formula I kept showing to you, the Lagrangian of the standard model of particle physics. At bottom, the Lagrangian of the standard model is only a regularity, right? It is only a report of past regularities. But again, as we mentioned with David Hume, is there any guarantee that these laws are going to continue into the future? No. Strictly speaking, we don't know that. Anyway, so if you go back to this picture, so we want to limit reason to make room for faith. Now, more specifically, there's a whole bunch of concepts that Kant wants to bring in. And these concepts are freedom, immortal soul, God, Maybe something else I'm missing, but at least these three. So what are we talking about? So these are the things that are not objects of my experience. I do not know if they exist, but I postulate them for moral reasons. So these would be the postulates of pure practical reason. Postulates. But again, postulates are assumptions. And again, they are postulates for moral reasons. And so we could go over them step by step, but it's like Kant is going, it's like in the spirit of the Enlightenment, in this naturalistic worldview, he's going to say, look, we have no experience of God. We have no direct experience of God. We have no natural knowledge of God. And again, like, think about this. If you had some deeply inspiring experience, right? Let's imagine you saw, not an apple, but you saw an angel with golden wings. Would that prove the truth of Christianity or the existence of God? Well, strictly speaking, the only thing that you have seen are certain appearances, right? How do you know that you are not asleep? How do you know that you are not hallucinating? How do you know that you are not on drugs, right? So it's like that's always a problem, that you can look at the things they appear to you, but you can never really make conclusions about reality as it really is. Now, of course, we don't actually see angels with golden wings in the sky. And that's a bit of a problem for religion. And very important is also, there's also a big problem, the problem of evil. Because it's not only the case that the world does not show, God does not manifest himself or herself or itself. God does not manifest in the world. It's much worse than that. It's quite obvious that this world, at least on the surface appearances appears to be forsaken. We are forsaken. Children die horrible deaths, from cancer or something like that. This world is full of seemingly unnecessary evil, the problem of evil, right? And Kant is aware of that. And he doesn't want to minimize that. But still, he wants to say that in order for our moral outlook to make sense, we have to postulate the existence of these things. So again, remember, we talked about, again, in many philosophers, we have talked about how the idea of God is problematic. You can already see this in Descartes. But also, we talked in David Hume, or even in John Locke, how the idea of the soul is problematic. Because, of course, from moment to moment, I have a certain set of appearances. I have a certain set of, how should I put this, perceptions, right? It's a flow of perceptions from moment to moment. But do I ever perceive myself as a substantial thing? Can I guarantee that I am the same person I was 5 minutes ago, or 1 hour ago, or a day ago, right? And the answer is no, because the idea of personal continuity in my head is first and foremost due to a certain mental construction, right? So I have certain memories about the past, which exist now, and I have certain anticipations about the future, which exist now. And from this point in the future, I, so to speak, project myself into the past through memory, and I project myself into the future through anticipation. But I do not have any unproblematic access to myself as I exist in and of myself, right? So I, with respect to myself, I am also noumenal. I do not know whether I exist continuously from moment to moment, or as some Buddhist schools would have us believe, actually the whole world is destroyed and being reborn from moment to moment. There's continuity of karma, but anatman. There's no soul. The soul is not substantial. You, technically speaking, are like, it's as if you have been reincarnated this moment into this body with the memories. Again, this is how karma works. But they are not your memories in an important sense. You have just been born with them. In the same fashion how I have not chosen and you have not chosen, or at least as far as we remember, we have never chosen to be born as humans, right? In the same fashion, we have never chosen to be born with these particular memories. We find ourselves with these memories, right? With these dispositions, etc., etc. So God is out the window, soul is out the window. Let's talk about freedom. So likewise, Kant insists that for any particular action, I can never be sure what is the reason for the action. Again, think back to Hume. Hume says, okay, let me do a little simple demonstration, right? So I flip the switch, and the lights, they turn on and turn off. Can I guarantee that my flipping of the switch caused the lights to turn on and turn off? Hume says, no. the only thing I saw is just a regularity. Now, this regularity repeats itself over and over and over again, and I can build certain theories on this regularity, and this irrationally convinces me that there is a necessity. But in fact, the only thing I see is regularity. So for a similar reason, the again, you see, the cause of the lights coming on and coming off are not apparent to us. You see the flipping of the switch and you see the lights, but the cause is not there. In the same fashion, when I ask myself, why do I do the things I do? Honestly, Kant would have to say, I have no idea. Right? I observe my body behaving in certain ways. You hear me speaking, I hear myself speaking. But do I know the deep reasons for my speech? No, not really. Kant says, again, this is not something that is obvious or apparent to me. I do not see my soul, and therefore I do not feel a substantial freedom. And so it's like, sometimes people will point to experiences, they would say that there was no cause of my action, and so I must have been free. But you see, that's a problem. That's a problem. Because the fact that you do not see a cause doesn't mean that there is no cause. She's like, I have no idea why I've done that. I have no idea why I've done that. That could mean your decision was free and there was no cause, or it could mean that there was a cause, you're just unaware. And of course, let me write the word Freud, let me write the name of Freud on the board. Well, and Nietzsche before Freud will talk about this, the unconscious, the unconscious. In many ways, Kant discovers the idea of the unconscious. Well, he's not the first one, but Kant talks about the idea of the unconscious before Freud and Nietzsche. Again, especially this notion that you can have unconscious motivation. Now, Kant, because he's not just a philosopher, he's a Christian philosopher, he's also plagued, he's also concerned about questions of guilt and responsibility. And so what Kant is really interested in is when you do something which outwardly seems good, but secretly your motivation is sinful. And Kant insists that you can never really know if your motivation was pure and you did it out of, let's say, respect for the moral law, as he would put it, or you did it for some crass motive. You did it just to impress others or to gain some advantage, some selfish advantage. You can never know what your motivation is. Yes. So I'm already moving into the territory of ethics and therefore maybe a little bit politics. But there's one thing I need to mention with respect to phenomena and noumena. I feel that it's a bit of a, the way the flow of this presentation has gone. It's going to break our flow a little bit, but I just want to signal this, right? So when you talk about the relationship between the phenomena and the noumena, how do the two relate? You could ask this this human question: is there any necessity between this relation? Is there any laws or regularities, right? So it's like you can ask Hume, when I'm going to wake up, well, if, let's not say wait, let's not say when, let's say if. If I wake up tomorrow in the morning, what will the world look like? Will I see familiar colors? Will Euclidean geometry continue to hold? Will the laws of arithmetic continue to hold? Will, laws of physics continue to hold? And Hume says, strictly speaking, you have no idea. There is no rational ground to believe that the future will resemble the past in any fashion, right? Anything may change tomorrow. Hume actually, when he talks about mathematics, he says, even if mathematics is solid knowledge, which we cannot know, but even if we imagine that all mathematics is reducible to some kind of solid logical, tautological reasoning, Hume says it's always possible to make mistakes. Mathematicians make mistakes. So, like, if you let's say multiply 12 by 11 and you can make a mistake, then in any mathematical operation you can make a mistake. And so the fact that other people have double-checked you, this you think decreases the probability of an error. But how do you know? Maybe there's some kind of systematic bias, and so we're all making a particular mistake at the same time. So Hume has this. Hume is always inviting us to doubt everything, even the truths of mathematics. Like, even if mathematical knowledge in principle is infallible, human beings are fallible. And so even if math never lies, human beings make mistakes. So how can you double check? Anyway, apologies, right? So Hume is going to say there's no way for you to guarantee that the future will resemble the past. And Kant invents this, again, I don't want to talk about this in detail because it's a whole separate topic, but Kant invents this notion of synthetic a priori. Synthetic a priori. would take some time to explain exactly what this phrase means. I don't want to go into this right now. But basically, this refers, for Kant, to, sometimes people call us necessary matters of fact. Necessary matters of fact. Well, again, like certain things about like constants of experience, you could say. But I think a better way to understand this is that Kant would talk about conditions of possibility of experience. Conditions of possibility of experience. So Kant would say, if I wake up in the morning tomorrow, right, certain things will remain true of my experience, not because the world will remain the same, but because in order for me to have an experience at all, certain conditions must be met. So this would be, synthetic a priori would be something like the conditions of general like experienceability of the world. Let me give you an example. So Kant, actually contrary to Hume, Kant believes that, for example, Euclidean geometry is one such universal. Kant imagines, does he have a proof? Unfortunately, no, Kant doesn't have a proof. And in fact, if we look at Einstein, there's actually a strong counter-argument on the other side. So Kant was actually wrong about this, as far as we can tell. But still, Kant says that the postulates of Euclidean geometry are conditions of all possible experience. That, like, if I'm going to have any experiences at all in the world, if I'm going to have any experiences at all in the morning tomorrow, the parallel lines still can never cross, let's say, right? Or it's like, how do you phrase the parallel postulate? You give me a line, and you take another line which is parallel to it, and you can only draw one line which is going to be parallel, right? And you construct them through perpendiculars. I think this is how the parallel postulate works, something like that, right? And so, but again, the point is, and Kant talks about all sorts of things. So he talks about Euclidean geometry, Euclid, but he also talks about things such as, for example, causality, space, time. Let's write something else. Laws of conservation laws. So Kant basically thinks that these are not true of the world. The world is noumenal. We have absolutely no natural knowledge of the world. We have no idea what goes on in the world. But in order for the world to be experienceable at all, and you could say to humans, but actually Kant, it seems, talks about all rational creatures of the universe. You could say, who are other rational creatures? Well, there's some intimation that maybe Kant is talking about aliens and angels. Some intimation about that. So for all rational creatures of the universe, in order for you to be able to perceive the world must be Euclidean. There must be causality. There must be space. There must be time. There must be conservation. Now, notice, we're not saying that space exists objectively in the world. That's noumenal. We have no idea about that. We cannot say anything about that for sure. What we can say is that whatever my experience will be tomorrow, it will be experience in space. It will be experience in time. Experience is impossible unless it is experience situated in space and in time. And again, in an important sense, space and time exist in my head, not in the world. This is kind of subjective space, subjective time. And what the world looks like, we have no idea. Maybe there is no space and there is no time objectively out there, right? In this sense, also, when you talk about the synthetic a priori and all these other things, right, you could say that what is important for Kant is that, and this is actually what is called Kant's Copernican revolution. So I promised to not talk about this in detail, and here I am talking about this in detail. This is Kant's Copernican revolution. He calls it himself. He said he's being very modest about this. He says, this is my Copernican. Copernicus had his revolution. This is my Copernican revolution. And Kant's Copernican revolution is basically, he says that philosophers in the past thought, again in this Aristotelian fashion, that objects exist outside of our mind, and they, so to speak, impress on our mind. If you imagine the word impression, right? I would imagine etymologically, right? You can take a wax tablet and you press something into it, and what is left is an impression, right? So the object is active and the mind is passive. The object is active and the mind is a passive recipient. So the object is active and the mind is passive. This was the old Aristotelian worldview. And so Kant switches this around. He says, no, it's actually the objects are noumenal. We have no idea what the objects are. But what is very important, like the upshot of Kant's Copernican revolution, is that the mind is active. Mind is active. Mind constructs our experience. So the way an artistic metaphor, you could say the beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? So beauty is not in the object. Beauty is the way you construct your subjective experience. Your mind constructs a subjective experience, right? This is what Kant would say, right? So causality and space and time and Euclidean geometry are like beauty. They are not in the world. They are in your head. This is the way, like, if you kind of, I want to say maybe psychologizing Kant is a bit problematic, but let's try. It's like if you take contemporary neuroscience, the idea is that, there are certain stimuli of your nerve endings, right? But it's basically just electrical stimulation of particular nerves, right? And then what your brain does is it takes all of this input, electrical input, right? And what the brain does is from this electrical input, the brain constructs a certain image in your head. But the brain does this. The brain does this. I don't see the chair as it really is. The experience of the chair is a collaboration between the chair as a thing in itself and the active categories of my perception, the activity of my mind. So the simplest way, this is an oversimplification, but the simplest way I know of phrasing this idea is that perception, to some extent, is imagination. Perception is to some extent like imagination. It's not exactly imagination, because I told you, right? Imagination, I can close my eyes and imagine a rose. I open my eyes, I cannot visualize a rose, right? But perception is a little bit like imagination. And if you think about all sorts of illusions that happen, simplistic example, obviously, but you can very often see how the brain, how the mind constructs our experience and creates certain illusions in the process. I don't want to talk about this now. Now, also, let me stress that one way to try to unpack this, and I think McGee talks about this in his chapter on Kant, is that if you imagine different animals, how they see the world, right? So I see this marker as red. I have certain human beings are trichromatic, I think, right? So we have we perceive colors through okay, apologies. My theory of color is a bit rusty. But anyway, so human beings have a certain visual apparatus. We distinguish certain colors, and we distinguish certain wavelengths of light. We cannot see ultraviolet, we cannot see infrared, right? But my dog or my cat have a different kind of visual apparatus. What does the marker look like to them? It's probably different, right? And you could say, but which experience is true? And frogs can presumably see infrared, as far as biologists tell me. Frogs can see infrared, so probably this marker looks different to the frogs, right? And you can compare my experience, my dog's experience, and a frog's experience, and you can say, like, but which of them is the real marker? And this is none of them. None of them is the real marker. The real marker is this thing on the other side, and these are three different constructions, which tell you about the marker as much as they tell you about the person or object, or I don't want to say object, the being that sees the marker. The way you see the marker tells you as much about the marker as it tells you about your brain. It's a collaboration between you and the brain. And this is a super important idea, so let me signal this, right? So I'm a bit running out of space, but like on the one hand, this is a very strong side of Kant. And you will talk next year, no doubt, about this idea of social construction of reality. Social construction of reality. This notion that not only your genetic makeup, but also your cultural makeup influences the way you see the world. Right? That the world, in some sense, changes because our concepts, our culture changes. Right? So different people see the world differently, right? And again, like you walk into this room, everything in this room is familiar. You know what's a table, you know what's a chair. Like your visual experience of the room is different from a visual experience of, let's say, if you take a medieval peasant and just put them in a time machine and transport them into this room, the peasant would not understand all of this. These are unfamiliar materials, unfamiliar colors. Like, imagine a medieval peasant looking at this and not being sure whether it's a chair or not. Right? So the idea is that, again, your experience is different. And this led to a very important, very fruitful, productive project after Kant of trying to understand this, and especially understand the ways in which society influences the way we understand things. And this is going to have political implications, right? Because one thing that you could say is that nobody in and of themselves is a sinner, or a witch, or a criminal, or a policeman. It is certain kinds of cultural codes that enable you to see certain people as criminals, or witches, or policemen, or whatever, right? And Notice, right? We still believe that there are criminals, but we don't believe that there are witches. So this kind of cultural relativity presupposes that maybe one day we'll have a society in which there's no such word as a criminal. We will not be able to see, like, the actions will be similar, but we will describe them differently. We will say, oh, maybe these people are mentally ill, or something else. I don't know. It's like complicated, controversial topics. I don't want to go into that, but that's the idea again. The cultures evolve, or like the ideas of saints. Presumably, in the Middle Ages, people had a much more, like immanent understanding of saints. Saints were part of the everyday inventory. Yeah, you knew that there were saints around you, maybe who could perform miracles. By and large, in today's world, like again, Max Weber calls this disenchantment. We don't actually, even if you believe that saints exist, maybe they only existed in the past, or they happen super rarely, right? Again, the perception changes. Again, next year we'll talk about Michel Foucault. Foucault talks about how in the Middle Ages there was this notion that there were people, they weren't like who acted strangely, but they were not mad. They were not mad. Maybe they were divinely inspired. Maybe God spoke through them. And then after the Industrial Revolution, these people, you just send them to the madhouse, right? So it used to be that they were prophets from God, and now you send them to a mental asylum, right? And it's kind of a potential change there, right? Anyway, so this is the positive part of the project. The negative part of the project, I don't like the criticism of Kant is that Kant forgets history. And when Kant talks about these things and says these are necessary conditions of experience, many philosophers after Kant would say, again, people like Hegel, people like Herder, people like Hegel, people like Marx, people like Foucault, would say, no, actually the task of philosophy is not to search for universals and for necessary conditions. No, the task of philosophy is to search for things which appear universal and necessary, but in fact are contingent. So it appears universal and necessary that the poor people cannot vote. But in fact, it's culturally contingent. Or it appears natural necessity that women are not allowed to get education. But actually, it's just a matter of contingency, right? So culture, or let's say slavery, right? So ancient discussions of slavery, most philosophers who talk about slavery don't actually imagine that slavery could be abolished. It seems, somebody like Aristotle, natural, inevitable, right? But the task of philosophy, the critical task of philosophy, is to discover that actually, who knows, through transhumanism, connect yourself to an AI, all of this stuff, right? Augmented reality. Maybe we will stop seeing the world in Euclidean terms. How ideas of causality, maybe that could be challenged, right? Space and time, think of, I don't know, some psychedelic experiences or transcendent, who knows, right? So maybe all of the, Kant says that these are necessary universal conditions of experience for all rational creatures of the universe, including aliens and angels, but maybe, no, these are just conditions of experience of a small bourgeois by the name of Immanuel Kant, right? Small, I mean, in the large scheme of things. One tiny human being in a particular corner of the universe, right? So, how much time do we have? 22 minutes. Yeah. So that's one side of the story, right? There's also another side of the story, which is morality, and I want to talk at least a little bit about morality. Yeah. So far, I hope we're good. Is this clear? Any questions or problems about any of this? How much are you responsible? How much of this are you responsible for, right? Well, if you understand this distinction phenomena and noumena, we're good. Synthetic a priori, again, is kind of. I could talk about the reason why he uses this word synthetic and a priori. Could lead us astray. A priori means before. So these are the things which must be true before experience, before any kind of experience is possible. That's the meaning of the word a priori. And why it's synthetic? Well, there's analytic a priori. Analytic a priori is like a is equal to a, or 2 + 2 is equal to 4. So analytic a priori are things which are true by virtue of tautology, of a logical identity. And synthetic a priori, in this sense, Kant imagines that they must be true necessarily, but not by virtue of tautology. But why are they true? Because they deal with these conditions of perceptibility of all experience. Something like that. If this is not clear, don't worry too much. Again, but this is technical jargon. Okay? Let me talk about morality. So how does morality fit into all this? So far, I didn't really speak very much about morality at all, right? But let us talk about morality, right? So the Kant's project is, again, limit reason to make room for faith. Limit reason to make room for faith, and especially we talk about these ideas of freedom, soul, God. Now, again, let's recap. Let's recap a little bit, right? So Kant says you cannot know whether you are free or not free. You cannot know whether you have a soul or you do not have a soul, or like continued existence through time. You cannot know whether there's a God or no God. In fact, well, we'll talk about this in a second, but it's very important. For Kant, the word God is a certain kind of conceptual apparatus. It is a certain X. It's not a personal God of Pascal, something you feel in your heart. No, it's very dry. It's very functional. Right? I don't want to use. It's like you'll see what I mean in a second. And technically speaking, it is a certain X about which you cannot know anything at all. You just postulate it because there's a moral reason for it. So anyway, so limit reason to make room for faith. Limit reason to make room for faith. So there is a particular faith, and there's a particular morality that Kant begins with. Now, again, I told you that there's this bit back and forth. Kant is very influential, but also very controversial. This part of the picture is mostly where people agree with Kant. This part of the picture is where most important philosophers after Kant disagree with Kant. So again, people like Hegel, people like Nietzsche, people like Marx will say, well, again, so let me try to like give you an oversimplified summary of Kant and oversimplified summary of the criticism of Kant. Kant says, in order for life to make sense, in order for my life to make any sense at all, in order for life to have any meaning at all, I have to postulate certain things for moral reasons. Otherwise, the world just doesn't make sense. This is like an oversimplified version. And the response is basically, no, to you, Kant, maybe the world doesn't make sense. But we, Nietzsche or Marx or Hegel, will have new morality, better morality, which is not going to require your assumptions, which is not going to rely on the notions of freedom or soul or God. Right? So this is the short version. Now, longer version. Let's go back to Pascal's wager. I feel that there's something similar to Pascal's wager going on here. Kant basically wants to, I think the logic is something like this. Kant wants to say, I wake up in the morning and I decide what to do. If Newton is right and everything is determined, then we end up, and Kant has this very beautiful phrase, he says, der Schlund des zwecklosen Chaos der Materie. The world is the abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter. The abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter. Nothing makes any sense. Nothing makes any difference. One person wakes up in the morning and plants flowers. Another person wakes up in the morning and eats children. And it doesn't matter, because this is matter in motion, and this is matter in motion. Right? And again, matter in motion, chaotic matter in motion, which obeys these mechanistic laws. Again, this anti-teleology, so this is teleology versus mechanicism. In this sense, Kant tries to bring teleology back. So mechanistic versus teleological worldview, teleological. From the Greek word telos, which means aim or purpose or goal. Again, teleological worldview is not theological, right? We're talking about natural aims, a natural hierarchy of goals in the universe, right? And notice, somebody we have talked about a little bit, and we'll talk more in later classes, Thomas Hobbes agrees with Kant on this point completely. Hobbes says, if you begin with materialistic premises, if you say the world is just chaotic matter in motion, which follows something like Euclidean regularities, then nothing is good or evil in and of itself, says Hobbes. Hobbes has this famous phrase, you might have heard from me, right? Whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire is that which he calls good. And the object of his hate and aversion is what man calls evil. But there, Hobbes says, is nothing absolutely, simply and absolutely so. Nothing in and of itself is good or evil. It's just, emotivist theory of morality, right? So basically, if I try to erase this, let's leave this stuff. So we can talk about for certain characteristic philosophers. Let's get some names on the board. Like, I wonder which color I should say. Yeah. So philosophers like Hobbes, philosophers like David Hume, philosophers whom we'll talk about later like John Stuart Mill, right? these philosophers, if you really want to be adventurous, you can add Nietzsche with a question mark. Nietzsche is always with a question mark. Nietzsche is an interesting philosopher. So these philosophers espouse the compatibilist view, compatibilism. So compatibilism is a form of determinism. So they would say that to be free is simply to be determined by the right kinds of causes. To be free is simply to be determined by the right kinds of causes, right? So for them, all human behavior stems from desire. So all behavior stems from desire. So desire motivates behavior. And more specifically, morality is just simply a way of talking about certain kinds of desires, desires which lead to good consequences, desires that which we have in common, for example. So morality is simply a matter of desire. Whatever people like, they call good. Whatever people don't like, they call evil. Like, every living being has certain physical makeup that leads every living organism to seek some sort of homeostasis, to try to preserve itself, by and large, right? And the idea is that this is a value-neutral third-person description. We're just trying to survive. Humans are just trying to survive. Lions attacking zebras. Lions are not evil. Lions are not evil. Biology works this way. In order to survive, lions need to attack zebras. So in this sense, all morality has to do with self-interest and the pursuit of happiness. And the pursuit of happiness for yourself, right? And very importantly, for Hobbes' human male, in many ways, politics is just a continuation. It's just an extension of this project of satisfying desires. So the right way to understand political philosophy is that political philosophy finds the best way to satisfy our collective desires. Hobbes is going to talk about our collective desire for security, to be safe. David Hume and John Stuart Mill in general are going to talk about how, in some sense, like the justification, if you want, of us obeying the laws, or in general of the social order, is that, again, this is social contract, right? The legitimacy of the government is derived from the consent of the governed. The government is entitled to order us around, to command us, because at the end of the day, everybody's better off. Or let's say almost everybody's better off. You can always find exceptions. I don't know, people like, potentially, philosophers always like to talk about, psychopaths or sociopaths. But a tiny minority, a tiny percentage of the population, we just forget about them. Again, notice we talked about this the other day. Strictly speaking, on this view, psychopaths, or like maniacs, are not amoral. They are not evil. They're simply different, and society protects itself from them the same way we protect from lions or bears. We don't say that lions or bears are evil, right? It's just the way they are, and we act in self-defense. This is the picture. And Kant doesn't like this picture. Now, I think at the end of the day, the reason why Kant doesn't like this picture, Kant says, otherwise morality is impossible. And again, philosophers after Kant would say, your morality, Kant, is impossible. But in general, we can have different morality. And I feel that in order to understand Kant, we have to remember that he's a Christian. And also we have to remember that he's a very careful reader of Augustine. We talked about Augustine last semester, you will remember. And it is important for within the Christian worldview that, especially within the Augustinian Christian worldview, that human beings genuinely have a choice to sin or to do good things. And among other things, this makes sense of rewards and punishments in the afterlife. So some people are going to be sent to heaven for all eternity, and some people are going to be damned in hell for all eternity. So in order for this picture to make sense, it must be the case that my actions are really my own, and I am responsible for them. You don't say that lions will go to hell for all eternity. That sounds weird, right? So God made lions so that they need to hunt and eat. I'm not even sure if lions, some predators, I think, cannot survive on a purely vegetarian diet, right? So, complicated story. Don't want to go into this right now. But so you don't say that lions will go to hell, right? So this is an entirely different picture. On this picture, and Hobbes says this quite explicitly. He says human beings are like mechanical clocks. There is no interesting difference for Hobbes between a human being and a mechanical clock, right? So Hobbes would say that, yeah, I have certain desires. Today we would say pre-programmed by evolution. They have a certain genetic code. And within me, I have something like Hobbes metaphorically calls a wound spring, skručena pružina. And it tries to unwind, right? And I act. And things that I find pleasurable, I try to do more of. Things I find unpleasant, I try to do less of. And Kant says, but at the end of the day, this is meaninglessness. Again, the abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter. Nothing is objectively good or bad. Nothing objectively makes sense. And nobody deserves heaven or hell. And by the way, Hobbes, for exactly this reason, Hobbes does not believe in eternal hell. And he advances theological arguments against the eternity of hell. Some theologians have done, Christian theologians have done this throughout the ages, so there's something to be said about that, right? And so basically Kant wants to say that I do not know, but I have to assume, and notice, I do not know, and I can never prove. And in fact, well, it's a long story, but anyway, so Kant says, I can never know whether I'm free or not. I can never know whether I'm free or not. But again, this is where the Pascal's wager comes in. I don't know, but life makes sense on the assumption that I am free. I cannot prove that I am free, but life makes sense on the assumption that I am free. So I must assume that I am free. I must assume that I am free. And this actually is, in many ways, maybe an important argument because when Kant talks about freedom and this assumption, there's this Hume's guillotine, is-ought problem, that you cannot really derive an ought from an is. It's a whole separate story. I don't know. It's a whole separate lecture, right? Nietzsche is going to make a lot of this. How yes, maybe we have desires, but satisfaction of desire naturally, automatically is not good. Now, as a description of the way humans work, like as a descriptive morality, it works. But as normative morality, it doesn't work. Because again, nothing is good or evil in and of itself. And so, Nietzsche is going to take a cue from Kant and is going to try to unpack this in various directions. But anyway, I'm sorry, I'm talking about things which are maybe slightly more complex. Let's bring this down to earth. Let's bring this down to earth, and let's just try to say things clearly. So basically, Kant wants to say that your action is moral only if it is free, and more specifically, if it is free from these deterministic mechanisms. So there's a certain ideal of selflessness built into Kantian moral picture. So a free action must be free from desire, free from influence of desire. So let's imagine, Hobbes has this example. Hobbes says, I see a poor person in the street begging, and I give them alms, right? I give them pity. But I don't do this because I like the person. I do this just because, as Hobbes says, I have a pain of compassion. It actually pleases me to give alms to the poor. Right? So it's ultimately self-interested, if you want, in some sense, selfish action. And is this, or maybe you could imagine a different example. I'm doing this in order to impress somebody. I'm lying in a facetious way. I'm trying to only make a good impression, but I don't really care about this person. And Kant says, if you are determined by desire, you are like a mechanical clock, and therefore your actions cannot be morally good or morally evil. And again, in some sense, Hobbes would agree. No action is morally good or morally evil, right? Because morality does not exist. It's an invention. It's a human invention. Morality is artificial. So, but if we are free from desire, we must act. Well, it's like again, we must act. We must only care about our intention, and we must not care about consequences. Care about consequences, and very importantly, the happiness has to play no role. Happiness is irrelevant. So the fact that something makes you happy does not make it good or bad. And this is actually Kant's criticism of the golden rule. Sometimes categorical imperative is compared to the golden rule, but the golden rule is not the categorical imperative. The golden rule is this, selfishness. You do to others what you want them to do to you. There's nothing moral in that. In fact, Robert Paul Wolff in your home assignment has a wonderful phrase. He says, a sadist is just a masochist who follows the golden rule. A sadist is just a masochist who follows the golden rule. For Kant, there's no morality in that. Kant actually gives a very interesting example. He says, imagine a criminal telling to the judge, Judge, don't do justice. Go easy on me. Go easy on me. Who knows? One day, you judge, maybe you will become a criminal as well. And you will want the judge to go easy on you, and the judge, supposedly, out of compassion, because this will make the judge happier, maybe the guilty person happier, right? And Kant says, no. Morality is not about that. Morality is about, what morality is about. If you have to be free from desire, then how are you going to act? Well, that's the issue. The existentialists and people like Nietzsche would say you have to just be free, just completely free, not bound by anything, right? Complete undetermined freedom, Hegel is going to talk about this as a moment of pure indeterminacy. Let me write the word existentialism. But Kant doesn't like this idea because, you know, it's going to lead to chaos. Chaotic, unpredictable action, freedom for freedom's sake. So instead, we're out of time, right? No.
6 minutes.
Six.
Six.
How much time do we have?
6 minutes.
We have 6 minutes. Okay, yeah. I see that you have some questions, but let me just finish the sentence, right? So Kant, you know, this idea could work for Kant, maybe, but he doesn't go that route. He tries to find something within. It's like, remember when we talked about Plato and Aristotle, we had this idea of parts of the soul. So Kant wants to find a part of the soul which is free from desire. And the part from the soul which is free from desire for Kant is reason. And so what Kant wants to do is a very controversial, very problematic enterprise. He tries to derive morality rationally. He wants to find morality which will be defined in purely rational, logical terms. And what this gets down to is the so-called, well, this is the categorical imperative, and this is the so-called universalizability criterion, which we'll talk about in a second. Whatever. Was there a question?
I just wanted to ask, am I right if I say that the thing that matters is the reason behind your actions and your consequences, like if they're good or bad, it doesn't matter. So if you think that it is fun to give money to poor people, it is immoral just because you think that it is fun. So it is not the right reason according to Kant's morality, right?
Yes, exactly right. Now, you could say that you had the right reason and you also enjoyed the action. That's okay. But you see, that's the thing. We can never perceive ourselves. And so if you do something and you also enjoy it, for Kant, as a Christian, you will always be plagued by doubt. Did I do this for the right reason? Or did I do this just because I enjoyed it? And so Schiller actually has a very interesting epigram against Kant. And Schiller basically says that the only way for Kant to know that he's really certain is to hate everybody, every single human being with a passion. So that you know that you do the good things to them, you serve your friends, not out of any ulterior motive, because you really, really hate them with a passion. You do this completely selflessly, only out of respect for the moral law. Now, again, you understand, this is not what Kant requires, right? But there's a certain uneasiness, there's a certain problem there, right? So, universalizability criterion. So basically, now, it's difficult for me to explain this because there are some philosophers to this day who believe that this works. Now, I don't want to give you my opinion, so let me phrase this differently. Most important philosophers after Kant did not believe that this picture works. So Hegel does not think that categorical imperative works. Nietzsche does not think that it works. Marx does not think that it works. So it's like you have to understand, like if you do not agree with the premises, if you do not agree with the reasoning, you're not alone, right? So basically what Kant is saying is that an action is evil when it involves a contradiction. Now, more specifically, we're talking about actions, so free actions flow from intentions. So really, like if one person physically destroys the body of another, this is neither good nor bad. You have to ask, what was the reason? If this was murder, then it's evil. If your intention was like, I like killing people, that is evil. But if your intention was, I am executing a criminal, because execution and death penalty is fine for Kant, actually, right? Under particular circumstances, then it's okay. So it's like the action and the consequence is not what counts. What counts is the intention, right? Anyway, and so what Kant is saying is that he gives examples, and his examples are many. Let's just focus on one example. The example is the following. Imagine that I want to take some money from you, borrow some money from you, but I have no intention of paying back. Now, you can fill in the details. I'm not filling in the deal. You can try to fill in the details, exactly. So I am lying to you. I say, I'm going to give back the money, I promise, but in fact, I have no intention of keeping the promise. So what Kant is saying is that if you imagine trying to universalize that, again, the German is categorical imperative, handle so, dass die Maxime deines Willens jederzeit zugleich als Prinzip einer allgemeinen Gesetzgebung gelten können. Right? So you try to find a principle of action that could serve as the basis of morality for all rational creatures of the universe, potentially including aliens and angels. Right? So you're trying to find that kind of moral legislation. And Kant imagines. So let's imagine the principle of my action. Now, I'm not filling in the details, but let's sum up this. Right? So look, it's fine for people to borrow without the intention of paying back. It's fine for people to lie about borrowing and not paying back. Kant says, well, let's try to universalize that. Let's imagine if this was the universal law for all rational creatures. Then Kant says, what would happen is that potentially everybody could borrow without giving back. And so the meaning of the word borrow would be destroyed. The institution, the practice of borrowing would not exist. Because there's a difference between me saying, could I borrow this? And me just taking it forcefully. Right? There's a difference. But if everybody takes without the intention of giving back, this difference is destroyed. And so you run, again, and it doesn't matter that this is, this is going to make people happy or unhappy. Who knows? Maybe this will be a happier world if nobody borrows. Who knows? Kant is not interested in that. He says, your principle of action involves a self-contradiction. Let me give you another example. Well, let me give you two more examples in the same vein. Stealing. If you say it is okay to steal as a universal law, it means that there's no property, and therefore theft is impossible. So there's taking, but there's no such thing as stealing. Right? Because in order for you to be able to steal, it presupposes the existence of property. Another example. Lying. If everybody is allowed to lie, then communication breaks down, and lying becomes impossible. So it's, again, don't think about the consequences. Think only about the logical form. Let me give you maybe a criticism of Hegel of this, and maybe this will become slightly clearer. Hegel says, so what? Some institutions are maybe just bad. I don't know. It's like imagine an institution of feudal serfdom. Okay, certain things maybe within that institution are self-contradictory, but who knows? And some maxims of action might destroy the institution of feudal serfdom. But maybe that's a good thing, destruction of the institution of feudal serfdom, or destruction of slavery, or for that matter, destruction of property. Maybe in a Buddhist fashion, if we all lied all the time, communication would break down, there would be no lying, no speech, maybe we would all be happier, right? So that's the problem, right? Because you point to a self-contradiction, but it's not clear, to later philosophers, it's not clear why this self-contradiction has to take place. And by the way, notice, also very importantly, this becomes a contradiction only if you try to legislate. Because if you say, well, no, I'm lying because the circumstances are such, right? Kant has I should be letting you go. Kant has this very famous example. He says, imagine, I don't remember the details, so let me fill in the details, right? So there's a maniac chasing after your friend, and your friend is hiding in your house. And the maniac rushes to your door and asks you, is your friend in your house? You are not permitted to lie for Kant. Happiness is not important. Consequences are not important. Lying is just wrong. It's wrong all the time. See, this is where Kant and Hume part company. Hume is going to say, well, it's like, Kant, you're putting the cart before the horse, right? Moral principles are good if they lead to happiness. And if, exceptions, like for example, lying to a murderer, or let's say running a red light if you are trying to save somebody's life, I don't know, somebody's dying and you have to rush them to the hospital. Exceptions in these cases are justified. And this kind of morality has this very fundamentalist strain. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure if this is the most sympathetic presentation of Kant, but I think it makes sense if you remember that Kant is an Augustinian. He was a careful reader of Augustine, right? Because for Augustine, that's exactly the case, because you shouldn't care about anything. You should only care about your immortal soul. And the consequences are not important, because we will die, and God will rectify everything. But do you know that God exists? No, you don't, but you assume that God exists, because otherwise, this kind of picture doesn't make much sense. More specifically, Kant says that, he says that it's very clear, it's very obvious that people in the street, some of them are wicked, they're evil, and they prosper, they're happy. And some people who are good, charitable, whatever, virtuous, they suffer. Right? And Kant says our morality demands that we postulate an afterlife and God, a certain X about whom we cannot say anything, but just this function of somebody who keeps track of all the good things, of all the bad things, and then after we die, doles out the rewards and the punishments appropriately. Yeah. So when Karl Marx is going to talk about religion as the opium of the people, I think he has something exactly like this type of argument in his head. Okay. Anyway, in my head, I was planning, I have this superpower of warping time. I thought this would take 20 minutes. Somehow this took the whole class. Anyway, but I should be letting you go, colleagues. If you have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer. Otherwise, I hope this was somewhat clear. I tried my best to be clear, but also I had to go into some technical details, so maybe the balance was off a little bit. So anyway, again, if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer. Otherwise, thank you so very much. Stay safe, take care, and I will see you next Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.